Hulk Hogan appeared on Logan Paul's podcast for an interview to, in part, promote his new Real American beer. I got a lot of comments about this. People wanted me to cover it, so here you go. It was Hulk Hogan saying Hulk Hogan things. Most of what he says, I always say, if his lips are moving, you know he's lying. Or at least embellishing something. So I watched the entire interview. I watched it on my flight to Chicago the other day. I needed something to kill the time. So I watched the entire thing, all 1 hour and 20 minutes of it. Among other things, he says that due to all the back surgeries that he's had he known then what he knows now, he would have gone with the sleeper hold for a finish instead of the leg drop, given that he was 330 pounds with 24-inch pythons. And that would have been a lot safer on his body. He could have used that, or he could have used the Axe Bomber. He had a fucking clothesline as a finish in Japan. Logan asked him why Bret Hart is so bitter, and Hogan said that Bret hates everyone, name-dropping himself, Ric Flair, and Vince McMahon, which is some great company to put yourself in. Yeah, gee, I wonder why Bret might not like those three. And Bret is actually cool with Flair now. You know, he wasn't for the longest time, but he is now. But I thought that was rich. I can't understand why Bret he hates so many people. I mean, he hates me, and he hates Rick, and he hates Vince. What's not to like? The way those guys have all tarnished their legacies in the last 15 years, I'd be surprised if he did have such wonderful things to say about them. See, here's the thing with Bret. Bret Hart, the problem that people have with Bret is that Bret Hart is real. It is not bitterness. I don't see it as bitterness. I really don't. It may have been once upon a time, but yeah, I see a lot of stuff with Bret now, and he's with his grandkids, and I've seen him smiling more. And like some of the recent videos and photos I've seen of him in the last few years, he's actually smiling. He seems to be enjoying life. It's not bitterness. And if anybody had a good reason to be bitter or to be jaded, Bret Hart has a pretty good case, considering all the family members and all the friends and colleagues that he had in the business that are dead and gone. That's to say nothing of the stroke and all the health issues he had, the cancer scare, all of it. But I don't see it as bitterness. Bret Hart just speaks his mind. I don't agree with everything he says. The Goldberg stuff, it's over the top at this point. And his takes on certain talents, I don't agree with all of his takes on talents and the way they wrestle, and I could see his point of view on why there are certain types of wrestling today that he doesn't like. But I respect Bret when he says something because it doesn't have to come with a fucking disclaimer like some other people. You know how on Twitter, when somebody posts something misleading or false, you'll sometimes see reader notes added for context? That's Hulk Hogan. That's not Bret. I don't feel like Bret is just working people 24/7. Or if he's not working people, he's just completely delusional. And that doesn't sit well with some people. But he again pushed this absurd lie about wrestling in Japan in the 70s when there was this promotion called Pride. That was when he was working with New Japan. This is in his early years. And how he never knew if he was going to get in the ring with one of the boys or if he was going to get in the ring with one of those Pride guys like Bob Sapp. And I heard this and my head almost exploded. The problem with this is that Pride was a mixed martial arts promotion. It did not form until 1997. He's talking about 1977 or 79 or 80. This company didn't form until 1997. Bob Sapp fought for Pride in the early 2000s. He would have been 4 years old when Hogan worked for this fictitious Pride promotion. Of course, this is Logan Paul's podcast. This is not 60 Minutes. Logan Paul is not Mike Wallace. He's not going to call Hogan out on his bullshit because he doesn't know any better. He claimed that when he went back to WWE, his goal was to have a couple-year run with Stone Cold Steve Austin. And Hogan would be the heel so that he could just lose every night to Austin, and it wouldn't matter because he's the heel. Now, Hogan did quite a few jobs when he came back to the company in 2002. He was on his best behavior, and he did those jobs mostly as a babyface. You know, he lost to The Rock at WrestleMania. He lost to The Undertaker. He tapped out to Kurt Angle. He went out in a bear hug to Brock Lesnar, right? So he did a number of jobs that first year he came back. But if you think that Hogan would have come back to work a long program with Stone Cold Steve Austin And he would have been okay jobbing every night. You've had one too many real American beers. He brought up Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. Not the first time he's brought up Elvis. Here, he was asked if there were any people in the world that he wishes he could have met that he never got the chance to meet. And the first name he brought up was Elvis. He said Elvis used to come to the Mid-South Coliseum and sit way up in the stands so nobody would see him and he would watch the matches. And Hogan came along in Memphis right after he passed away, so they just missed each other. And that's true. Elvis was a big wrestling fan. He died in 1977. Hogan debuted in Memphis, I believe it was in 79. But he told a very different story in his book, where he claimed that Elvis used to come to the matches specifically to see him wrestle. He was such a big fan of Hogan's work. He was such a big Hulkamaniac before the days of Hulkamania. He specifically came to the Mid-South Coliseum to watch Hulk Hogan. The problem with that is that Elvis died 11 days after Hogan debuted in the ring, and 2 years before he came to Memphis. Maybe there's some time travel action going on here. It's kind of like when Hogan claimed he once worked 400 days in a year because with all the traveling back and forth between the US and Japan with the time zone difference, he worked 400 days. Maybe there's some of that going on here. The other person he says he wishes he got to meet was John Wayne. Hogan has his own John Wayne claim, which I've documented before. He has said that the head of Paramount, one of the major movie studios, once told him he wanted Hogan to be his next John Wayne. But Hogan didn't like the schedule they laid out for him, so he went back to wrestling. Sure. Hogan talked about being the third man at Bash at the Beach 96 and forming the NWO. He claimed that none of the guys involved knew that it was going to be him. He and Bischoff were the only two people who knew. Now, I don't know if Kevin Nash has commented on this before, but Scott Hall has said that they did not know it was going to be Hogan until just before they went out to the ring that night. He says Bischoff told them, if Hogan doesn't show, I'm going to send Sting out there as the third man. And even that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think Sting was already out there, right? I think it was Luger that got taken out of the match early. So I think Sting was already out there with Savage. But anyway, so Hall and Nash were at least told right before they went out that it was going to be Hulk. Hogan may not have known that in his defense because he wasn't at the building yet. By the time he got to the building, the match was already in progress. So he would not have known what Eric told the two of them before they went out there. But in the course of telling this story, Hogan made a very dubious claim. He said that he had creative control, which is true. He had full creative control. And it wasn't just over match finishes. He had full creative control over the body of the match, the flow of the match, the finish of the whole thing. He had 100% creative control. Anything they wanted him to do on TV, he did not have to do it if he did not want to. He had veto power. He's like the president. But he said in all the years that he had creative control in WCW, he never once used it. Never once pulled the creative control card to get a finish change. Never once pulled the creative control card to get an idea change or to say no to something. He said he never used it the whole time there. You know, it's one thing to lie about stuff or embellish stuff that maybe you could get away with, right? Like nobody would really know. What the hell? I'll tell a little white lie here and there. I'll make the story sound better. Wrestlers lie all the time. Hogan, though, has turned it into an art form. He has turned lying into an Olympic sport. And he lies about things that are just demonstrably false. Things that are even worse than this. In this case, I do believe that Hulk had Eric's ear on things all the time. And maybe he didn't need to officially pull his creative control card. He didn't legally have to pull his creative control card. But he was influential enough that if Hulk said, nah, brother, that don't work for me, that's all he had to say. Right? It's all a matter of semantics here. But Eric Bischoff himself, and there is no bigger Hulk Hogan fan on this earth than Eric, well, except Hogan himself, than Eric Bischoff. Okay, their time working together in WCW and in TNA, if Hogan ever stopped short, I'm sure Bischoff would have had brown all over his nose. Bischoff himself is on record as saying that Hogan used his creative control to go over on Sting at Starrcade in 97. That's Bischoff saying that. And that's to say nothing of Bash at the Beach in 2000, where Hogan went on Bubba the Love Sponge's radio show the day after the incident with Vince Russo and flat out admitted that he used his creative control to overrule Russo. And those are just the times that we know about. Even if you give Hogan the benefit of the doubt and say, well, maybe he was just referring to never having used his creative control up to that point in 1996 in WCW, and I don't think he was, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt, that's not how most people are going to hear that. So I think it's important to point out that he's full of shit. But that's not even the most egregious thing that he said in this interview. We can at least laugh at the absurdity and the stupidity of these tall tales that he tells. What's not funny, they were talking about Logan Paul being hated, not only on TV, but in real life. And how do you navigate that? He's going to be a girl dad soon. He's going to have kids and he may get soft. And how do you balance people hating you in real life as opposed to just your character on TV, right? They're having this real deep conversation. And Hogan said, talking about his own mistakes that he has made in his life, if Chris Benoit can do the crap he did and the fans still love him, you know, the fans are very forgiving. Who are these people that have forgiven Chris Benoit for murdering his wife and son? Like, we're not talking about thinking that Chris Benoit was a great wrestler. He was a great wrestler. No one who ever watched him, I think, would deny that he was a great wrestler. That's not what he said. What is this nonsense about forgiving Chris Benoit for murdering his family? A few dipshits on social media saying they love Chris Benoit and he should be in the Hall of Fame. That is not a great example to use for why wrestling fans are so forgiving and should forgive Hulk Hogan for all of the dumb shit that he has said over the years. But to even equate the two, that is truly one of the worst things that this man has ever said. And he has said some pretty offensive shit. This is up there in the top 3. Who the fuck is he hanging out with that he thinks wrestling fans have forgiven Chris Benoit for what he did? What a piece of shit. Seriously. Fuck off. The most honest thing that he said in the entire interview was when he said, if you're making more money than me, that's a shoot. That's why the business is a shoot to him. If he finds out that you are making more money than him for the same work or the same amount of work, that don't work for him. That's the most honest thing that I've heard him say. And understandable for a guy who worked most of his career on top as the #1 star in his profession. That was the one time I did not have to question whether I thought he was telling the truth. But it's one thing to mock all of his lies. It's another thing to make a statement like he made there. And if you are one of these people he talks about who's still defending Chris Benoit in 2024, you are as bad as Hogan is for even making such a ridiculous comment.